Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan. And on today's episode, we will be doing an entire show built around our dear Sculpty Boys patron perk, with Charles, Josh, and myself discussing meta-calls, what to prioritize with them, and what to consider when going into any given metagame. Before we dive into that, however, I do want to take a moment to thank our patrons for all the support you give. Your support goes towards continuing the show here, as well as events like the MLC. One of the patron perks is access to our Discord server, where we brew, share memes, and discuss spoilers, among other things. Another bonus for our patrons is access to the uncut video episodes of the podcast, which we call Uncut Gems. Because I don't let dead memes die. And you can submit a question to our newest show segment, Dear Sculpty Boys, which we will be doing today. So if you want to join the Sculpty Boy family, head on over to patreon.com/themindsculptors. You can find out more information there. It's time to check in on our Apple Podcast ratings. And this week we have 2 new ratings. The first one comes from Hollow Briscoe, who says, awesome, 5 stars. Love everything that you guys talk about and has helped me grow as a Magic player, so please keep up the amazing content. The second review comes from the Holy Moose, 5 stars, great cEDH podcast. Questions for Callahan. Do you think USC with Lincoln Riley will overtake the Ohio State University as the class of the Big Ten in 2024? How long until we have 1 or 2 super conferences of 40 to 60 teams that pay their players? Well, thank you for the review. That is a big question. And the short answer is no, I don't think Lincoln Riley will take over the Ohio State University, because we've been great forever, baby. We're not going anywhere. No, but actually, I think Lincoln Riley probably will make USC pretty powerful here, not too long. I'm really curious to see how the Pac-12, Big Ten, ACC thing works out. They still haven't really given a ton of information on that, so I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work. But this is not a college football podcast. But if you want to talk college football with me, myself, James, Dan, there's a bunch of other people, you can join us over on Patreon. So become a patron subscriber. And we have a patron channel called The End Zone. So subscribe, $2 a month. That's the lowest we have, I think, with patron access. And I'll talk college football all day long. Trust me. But with all that being said, let's jump into my conversation with Charles and Josh.
It's funny because Josh and I both work for the government, and one of the guys that I work up for also worked in a submarine and talks much like Josh about engineering aphorisms about being in a submarine. It's yeah, if you don't do this, everybody
everyone will die. Everyone
will die. There's a leak. Everybody, and guess what? You have a coffin in the water.
Yeah, we call it water in the people tank.
Yeah,
no thanks.
Water in the people tank.
Yeah, dude, that's fucking death.
Oh man.
Yeah.
It is a really bad way.
Terrifying.
To go. Yes,
it's absolutely terrifying. Yeah. It's happened once in my life, and I was on watch, unable to help at all, and I could not leave my station, and just had to hope that everybody else could do what they had to do.
So wait, what happened?
we can talk about this later. This is. After the recording.
This is almost like a content warning here for those who are very sensitive about death.
I need to. I want to.
And drowning.
This might be an interesting thing.
We can break here.
Well, this might be an interesting thing for the patron stuff, right?
The uncut gems.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So actually, if you guys go over to patreon.com/themindsculptors, you'll be able to hear this story that I'm about to give. And cut. Okay. So I was on a submarine on a daily basis, 8 hours a day. I sat in a room that was about 4 feet by 6 feet with 4 other humans. And I was sitting in a very shitty, uncomfortable chair. I'd rather sit on an airplane for 8 hours rather than sit in maneuvering on watch, looking at a bunch of meters and gauges, monitoring a nuclear reactor. So I'm sitting there. It's like 10 p.m. No, wait, other way around. 6 hours after. It's like 4 a.m. Other end of the night. It's 4 a.m, and I'm sitting there, and there's all throughout the boat there are announcement circuits. So there's speakers everywhere also. And so when you key the microphone and you turn it on, each speaker has a different sound. Like when you initially like pick up the phone, and has a different sound. And so if you pick up a 1MC, I know what that click sounds like. I hear those all throughout the day constantly. And the 4MC is the emergency circuit. Like, you must memorize where all of the 4MC phones are, because when shit goes down, you need to be able to find the closest one as fast as possible and alert everyone. And so it sounds different. Also, turns out when you make an emergency service like announcement, you kind of have to collect your thoughts before you just start like rambling bullshit. Because if your brain is scrambled and you give incorrect information, or it's just too jumbled and nobody can understand, people die. We literally have training about how to give 4MC announcements. So we're sitting there on watch, and sometimes you're bullshitting about nothing. Sometimes it's Magic the Gathering. Sometimes it's cars. Sometimes it's, you know, your partner or your friend's partner that you're on watch with or whatever. The conversations vary. At this point, no one was speaking. It was just silent, and everybody's just existing in maneuvering. And all of a sudden, we just hear like a of just like background fuzz, right? I look over to my electrical operator, and we go, that's a 4MC. And then all of a sudden, we just hear flooding in machinery 1, flooding from the forward drain pump. And we're like, oh,
hello.
Oh, by the way, the definition of flooding is at least 230 gallons a minute of water. 230. That's so much water. That's insane.
A lot of water.
Yeah, that is so much fucking water. So luckily, right, people know what to do when that happens. And so the chief of the watch took his actions. He, turned off the pump. He shifted water, because if water was going towards that direction, from this tank to this tank, and the leak was in the middle at a pipe or whatever, cool. Let's stop putting water to the hole. That'll help stop water from coming into the hole. Right. So, you can isolate the thing. And so no more water's coming in. But turns out for, 7 to 10 seconds, there was 230 gallons of water a minute coming through into the boat. Also, turns out electrical circuitry doesn't like water. And so when a giant gush of water came flying into the boat, it got onto some electrical switchboards and started a fire. So not only was there water in the people tank, but now there's fire. I don't know if you've ever seen a house fire or like an actual large scale fire. It puts off a shitload of smoke, like so much scary amount of smoke. When you're, I don't know, a few hundred feet below the surface of the ocean, and there's literally nowhere right for the smoke to go, you become blind in seconds. Right. It completely fills the compartment. You cannot breathe. They're like, oh yeah, get low so you can get away from the smoke. There's smoke everywhere. It doesn't matter. There's smoke everywhere. You literally have to leave, or you will just pass out and die from smoke inhalation. And so once again, luckily I'm sitting there on watch and like, well, I hope the chief of the watch knows what he's doing. There's water coming into the boat and no other announcements have been made. So it's like flooding from machinery 1. Oh shit. Everybody wakes up and, goes and does whatever they need to do, whatever their immediate actions are. Shortly after that, drain pump secured, leak is isolated, fire from the 8S switchboard. We're like, holy fuck. Like, okay, like on to the next thing.
The shit is getting shittier.
And the shit is getting shittier. And so, that emergency announcement comes online, and my electrical operator sitting next to me, luckily he is very experienced and knew exactly what to do. And he just like takes all these actions. He flips a bunch of switches and everything's fine. And the fire goes away. And we didn't die. And now there's all this cleanup to do, right? Because there's water everywhere. And so the lighting is grounded, so there's no lights. I don't know if you've ever been in like actual factual darkness. You probably haven't. Somehow it's darker than fucking nothing. Below the surface, 500 feet below the surface of the ocean, in a metal tube with no lights on, there's no light.
Yeah. Well, when you go even deeper than that, it's like really, really, really dark. It's like as if you're in space, right? It's like
they call it advanced darkness.
Yeah, it's really weird because it's like in space, at least you have the stars. It's here, it's like it's the void itself.
Yeah, there's just nothing.
Yeah.
And so the lighting is grounded and pumps aren't working. And there are 2 fuses that caught on fire. That's what came from the fire. One of the fuses was charred, like completely charred beyond recognition. We literally could not find the other one. It vaporized. It was fucking gone.
Wow.
So submarines, things like that don't happen very often. It was definitely a very niche case scenario. Flooding plus fire.
Right.
And luckily we train on that sort of thing like every other week so that when the worst case scenario thing happens, 160 people don't die.
Right.
But yeah.
So this question comes from Kino, and they ask, Dear Sculpty Boys, when brewing a new deck, what do you keep in mind about the metagame? Obviously, as with every competitive format, the specific meta of a given shop will vary, but in the generic worldwide metagame, what concerns are at the top of your priority list? We looked at this and we were immediately like, this is like a show topic, right? Like this isn't a segment answerable question. Like this is like a full 60 minutes. Let's talk about it. So Charles, you were about to like launch into something there. So like, what's your kind of whole take on this question, like immediately?
Okay, so I think there's a lot to unpack in the question, first of all. So I think there's 2 questions stated here. What do you keep in mind about the metagame? And the other one is, in the generic worldwide metagame, what concerns are at the top of your priority list? And based on how this question is worded, I think the latter is actually the question that you are really kind of focusing on, Kino. And so I figured that we hone in on that because there's actually a lot to go through with just that question itself, right? The question is kind of, for one thing, it's in the generic worldwide metagame, what concerns are at the top of your priority list? I would imagine that this leads to me thinking about concerns being like, okay, well, what are the decks that I am trying to compete against? What are what's sort of the pacing of this format's meta, and what are key cards or interactions am I looking out for, right? Am I looking at something that's more very spell slingy? Is the graveyard a resource that I'm really utilizing? But even before I even go to that, I think like the first thing that I actually think about when I'm thinking about that question is, what kind of deck am I playing?
Yeah.
Right.
Because that informs a lot of your decision making.
Yes. Yeah, because it's like, oh yeah, I really don't want to play against those stacks decks or something like that. And then, and you're saying this as you're piloting a stacks deck, right? And you're just like, yeah, I can't really play against rule of law. And so you use that as your answer of like, oh yeah, you got to have ways to answer rule of law, but you're also playing rule of law yourself, So it's not very helpful to talk about to answer this question of what are your concerns of like the priority list of things to be concerned about in the meta when the deck that you're brewing is in some ways part of that meta anyway. So in the set of things, right, that is competitive of various archetypes, whatever you're building is likely in that set already as its own element, and you need to factor that out and then consider the rest, right? And so then you can work your priority list there. So I'm actually going to bring this up to you, Josh and Callahan. How do you guys kind of want to go about it then? Because we're not actually told what deck. It's just a new deck.
Well, so here, I will say this as somebody who has a established cEDH list on the database that is built and constructed very much in the way of, here is a list that we think will be okay if you take it to a general meta, and here's 400 cards that would also be good as meta calls. And that's obviously Lavinia. I haven't talked about Lavinia very often on here recently, but I know with Lavinia, a lot of our process has been specifically going and seeing, okay, so what is the dominant strategy overall right now, especially when you're playing a deck like Lavinia, because that is very much the like anti whatever is popular at a given moment. And generally it's like the anti-Nas deck, right? You make a lot of your decisions in that of, so like a good example is like cutting knowledge pool, right? We cut knowledge pool based on the information that we gathered of against the general meta knowledge pool. People can like find their way out of it sometimes. And Omen Machine makes you play against their top decks, and you have ways of generating card advantage that they don't. So basically, the whole idea is knowledge pool isn't a bad card, and you shouldn't not play it. But in the generic sense, this is my 99 that I would recommend playing. And knowledge pool might be really good in your meta. I don't know. I don't play in your meta. But like going into Founders Club or the r/cEDH server or Nexus or any of these places where you can go get cEDH games on Discord, I have the 99 that we put on the database is the 99 that in our experience has been like the best against the overall meta. And that's kind of how I approach it.
Yeah, the way that I kind of jump onto that is, Charles, like you mentioned, we'll take my Adeline list, for example. I run all of the rule of laws, obviously not Arcane Laboratory, but I run all of the rule of laws you can run. You don't need to remove a rule of law from somebody else's board if you have a rule of law. So obviously that's not a consideration. What is a consideration is Dockside Extortionist and Thassa's Oracle, and to a lesser extent Spellseeker, right? Then those are kind of very problematic.
Underworld Breach.
And so, yeah. And sure, yeah, I'd love to run Spell Snare, but I'm on every single Torpor Orb effect, right? And for a while, I was only on, I think, 3 of them, only on the creature ones because I want to trigger Adeline. But like, there are certain things that, based on what your deck wants to do, then you just need to run every option of a given card. So like when it comes to your specific meta, like Charles mentioned, you have to take your archetype out of that equation,
right?
Unless, it's Drannith Magistrate, and obviously that's one-sided, right? But
my archetype is Drannith Magistrate.
Basically every way you could possibly find a Drannith. But so yeah, take your archetype out of the equation for the most part, and then the knowledge of your meta is so vastly important. Like was talked about on the Mono White Guys Go to Thraben and you, right? You guys talked about knowing, there's a tell. Obviously, you see their commander. So like Kess, come on, that's pretty easy.
Oh yeah, they're totally not going to use their graveyard, right?
No, not even. And so look for your Grafdigger's Cage or your Rest in Pieces or whatever, right, to shut down that aspect. And so just knowing what the meta is kind of informs what you might be seeing. And so for a while, when there was just a shitload of Quark and Sakashima, it was like, cool, let's find a rule of law, or let's find the Drannith to stop the thing from landing in the first place, or Swords to Plowshares to kill the Quark on Sakashima's way down.
It's interesting because like in 60 card formats, right, you have a sideboard. You have your main 60, and then you have the sideboard where you pull stuff in for specific matches because you're just like, game 1, it doesn't really work that way. Whereas Commander is your entire deck is your deck and your sideboard kind of all in one. So you have to be able to like have the toolbox, at least when you're playing stacks, in my opinion, right? Like if you're doing that at minimum, you kind of have to be able to like pivot, I guess.
So I'm going to abstract this back to what I was saying earlier about like archetype. Let's just assume that we don't even know the archetype now, right? And we're going to call it archetype alpha. The deck that you're building is archetype alpha. And what's cool is that archetype alpha could be one of the established archetypes that's already in this set of competitive decks in the meta. Or it could be something new altogether. So it could be any one of those things. It could either be something novel that no one's ever really formulated an archetype for, or it could be something that's established, like a stacks list or like a Grixis Adnos list, right? Mm-hmm. So now you have your archetype. Now you got to think about your meta, right? And as Josh kind of hinted at, there are some archetypes that actually do care about other archetypes of its kind in that meta, right? Like for rule of law decks, they don't really care if there's another rule of law per se.
Oh, cool, help!
Yeah. For Adnos lists though, right? They are actually conscientious of other people running Adnos, right? And
cool, someone else to take the Timna beats.
Yeah. And so when you have your archetype, right? I think one of the things that you'll think about is in terms of like, priority targets or concerns for your meta is like, okay, well, what is my archetype vulnerable to? What are the things that my archetype just doesn't care about, right? Imagine if, like, for example, there's a meta where, there's a Colossal Dreadmaw deck that only just plays Colossal Dreadmaw and others of its ilk, right? You're going to be like, well, my deck doesn't care about it, right? My deck is A-okay, pretty fine. Like maybe you built a Sakashima Kodama list and you're like, rule of law, whatever, right? Or maybe you're a stacks list and you're like, those rule of law decks I don't really need to think about, right? And so this is something that like I would say could be kind of helpful because you don't want to overload your thinking. The meta is huge. It's pretty vast. cEDH right now is kind of like in its Wild West period, and we got like legacy players coming in who are trying to like hone in and refine that list of decks. We aren't really there yet. And so in the meantime, you don't want to like overload on thinking about so many things because you're not going to be able to process it all, right? Try to reduce down to like your base fundamentals of like, okay, if I'm playing Adnos, right? Or if I'm playing like specifically like Kark Sakashima, rule of law is going to be an issue for me. Right. How do I deal with that? And focus it from there. Then your counterspells and interactions, specifically like with Kark Sakashima, right? Your counterspells and interactions, you'd be like, okay, well, what are these working at? And there, I think you want to focus on your color identities, right? What are my colors good for? What can I use them for, right? What are some very powerful cards that are proactive for me? And then like Dockside Extortionist, right? Dockside Extortionist needs no card to be answered for, right? It is the threat. Whereas, an offer that you can't refuse is a card that people often debate about. And it's a card that stands in certain contexts where you're like, this is the card that I need to play to deal with this, versus this is a card that's just completely useless against, I don't know, mono green elf ball, So work in that order is my suggestion.
So with this, theoretical archetype alpha, I start with, okay, what is my win con? And what are methods in my meta right now that prevent me from winning? Counterspells, torpor orbs, rule of laws, etc. Okay. How do I stop those? Okay. Counterspells, abrade, whatever, right? So then tech those into your list. Make sure you can win the game. I feel like that's pretty important when grading a cEDH deck is like, what is your win con? And obviously, how do you win?
Can you win the game?
Yeah. Can you win? Win the game. And then prevent others from stopping you from winning. Mm-hmm. And then, with whatever leftover slots you have, maybe this archetype is a stacks deck. So most of the slots fit into this last category rather than the former category. But, okay, what do I know about my meta and what slots do I have left over that can prevent others from winning? Whether that's counterspells or rule of law or torpor orb, right? Force of negation is not a great counterspell in maybe Rog Silas, right? Because Rog Silas doesn't give a shit about casting a Force of Negation on your turn. It wants to win as soon as possible. So Force of Will is the counterspell we're going for because I want to protect my stuff. I don't give a shit about stopping you.
It's interesting you brought that up because all my like Rector builds plays Pact over Fierce or Force, specifically because of that reason, where you want to be protecting your win on your turn. You're trying to use your pieces as sparingly as possible. You know what I mean?
And so the card disadvantage there is just far too detrimental.
Right.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And so that's kind of been my takeaways with that, right? With this theoretical archetype alpha.
I think you bring up a really good point here. One of the things that you can also think about is concessions. I'm not talking about like conceding the game, but things that that your deck isn't going to work very well, and deciding whether or not, am I going to compromise my ability to win the game by putting in cards that don't actually synergize with my deck just so that I can deal with stuff in this meta? Or am I just going to take the L for it, right?
Yeah, hope that thing never appears.
Yeah. And this is now almost like a self-reflection on you as the deck builder and pilot. Like, what am I trying to accomplish with this deck in this generic worldwide meta, right? That Kino you're talking about. Because am I trying to win at like a tournament that's a blind meta where I don't know what's there? So therefore, I should just maximize my tournament wins, right? Or my round wins. So I get the most easy, efficient wins, and within the tournament time length. We talked about this a lot. I know a lot of other content creators have also talked about this, that tournament time really sucks.
Yeah.
and you want something that either you need to play fast or you need a deck that can play fast, right? And you need to be cognizant of what your opponents are going to be running, right? In that situation, right, even though it's a blind meta, the context of what that situation is, it's a tournament, is going to be different. Whereas it could be like, I don't know, like the MLC, where the meta itself is literally like, hey, here's the whole entire list of decks. Here's what your opponents are playing. Both of them are technically generic. Both the MLC list is curated with, a large diversity of decks, and also the blind meta of a tournament is as generic as it can be sometimes.
Right.
It might also have regional bias. We don't really have data on that yet. But I mean, I know I talked with Mikey personally about this, and Mr. Dr. Professor Michael Levine as well, about like the fact that we have suspicion that the Punt City tournament that's coming up is going to be very different from Marchesa. I don't think someone piloting like a Heliod list without Soul Ring would do very well, nor someone playing Magda either. And the pacing will be faster. Tier 1 Con is coming up, right? And the whole European meta is very different there than the North American meta. Cicada from cEDH Brews, or who brewed this, talks about the fact that the Latin America meta is also very different here. And so even when you go into a blind meta, like knowing the context for how that blind meta is set up still gives you clues as to what you're getting into and sort of how fast the game is going. Or how slow it is.
To touch on Charles' concessions point, there's I'll just use an example. I'll use my Aruth list for an example. Drannith Magistrate turns off the deck. Whether Aruth is in the command zone, I'd rather Aruth be in the command zone when a Drannith Magistrate lands. So that is not a concession I make. We must deal with Drannith Magistrate. I'm on fucking Mouth of Ronam.
Yeah.
All right? Like, you have to deal with Drannith Magistrate in that list. As Charles found and knew because he helped round out the deck, Chalice of the Void is pretty difficult for this list to deal with because I'm not on Mog Salvage and I'm not on a Braid. So having artifact destruction is not something I'm privy to. I've got plenty of bounce spells that hit non-land permanents, but there are just certain things that you can't tech in your own tech for everything. Right. And so we must deal with Drannith. We might be able to. I've won through a fucking Lodestone Golem. Like, sometimes you don't need to deal with the artifact. Sometimes you do. And Chalice of the Void, that game against Charles in Philadelphia, was definitely one that needed to be dealt with. And I lost that game because I couldn't. And like Charles said, sometimes you just take the L.
You know, these are things that I think like people don't really take into consideration about like the quality of data that they're using and informing their deck. And when you go into evaluating the meta and things like that, you need to be able to share that with people who are helping you build this deck, right? And the people who are helping you build this deck need to be able to understand that as well. I feel like sometimes when brewers are giving advice, they're only giving advice from their own perspective and their own experience. And similar to like how your question is being asked here, Kino, where there's the local meta, right, versus the generic worldwide meta. How useful is this advice if I'm taking from someone who plays in the Adnos meta when the meta that I'm playing in is a stacks meta?
Right.
You know?
Welcome to my server.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if you're asking about the question of a generic worldwide meta, how useful is anyone's advice? You know?
Mm-hmm.
Like you almost kind of have to go off on you have to be very careful then, because you don't want to have these bad biases. There's like that classic example of the military back in the day. They would determine how good their planes were by checking like the bullet holes on the planes that returned back from combat. And the fallacy here was that they never factored in the planes that were shot down because they never returned.
Right.
They put armor on the incorrect portions of the plane because their planes that's like losing to a certain archetype over and over again, but not tracking your losses.
Yep.
And then saying, wow, I almost lost to Drannith Magistrate. I need to put 10 more lightning bolt effects in my deck.
Yeah.
That's stupid. You didn't lose to the Drannith. It was fine. Why did you made your deck worse. You made your plane heavier and less efficient because you were looking at the wrong data.
Well, that about wraps things up for us here this week. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode. If you liked this episode or any of our other episodes, please make sure to rate this show on whatever podcast platform you are on. And if you are listening on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a comment down below telling us what your favorite part of today's show was. I'd also like to thank our top tier patrons, Justin, Adam Hamden, David Snavely, Dionysius, Grady Goodenough, Jacob Turan, Jason Bialik, Matt Boehner, and Senior Coupon. If you too would like to support the show, you can head on over to patreon.com/The Mind Sculptors or check out the link in the description. Thank you again for joining us, and from all of us here at The Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.